Turning Pages, um, our author talk series from the Center for HBCU Research Leadership and Policy at Howard University. So we're fortunate to have you join us. We have an esteemed guest today. We have Dr. Paul Zeleza, who is Senior Advisor for Strategic Initiatives here at Howard, but also Professor of African Studies. Certainly, Dr. Zeleza is a renowned scholar with work, um, numerous works in a variety of areas, certainly related to African studies and other issues. I mean, I like to think when I was looking at his bio, I'm like, he truly is a Renaissance man, even a blogger, okay? In addition to a novelist and a short story writer. So again, we're here today to talk about Dr. Zeleza's book, Re-Envisioning the African and American Academies. And so we're excited about this really important work. I mean, it's a huge volume and there's so much rich information there. When I think about the work that we have before us, certainly in the HBCU Center, we're often looking for topics or ideas or issues that deserve further exploration. And Dr. Zeleza's book is certainly fertile soil for a lot of research. So excited to talk with him today and look forward to our conversation. So welcome, Dr. Zeleza.
Thank you very much. I'm really excited to be with you today and to have this conversation.
Well, thank you so much. So we're just going to get started. We have some broader questions that I'm going to pose to you, but also there are other questions that I have. I have tons of questions, most of which can't be answered in our time today, but certainly I think will certainly whet folks' appetite so that they will certainly will encourage them to read your book. So let me ask you just a broad question first. What inspired you to write this book, and what key experiences or influences shaped its creation?
That's a wonderful question. Writing this book really is part of my long-term interest and research in intellectual history, which I understand to be history of ideas, as well as, of course, the history of knowledge producing institutions on which I've published several books and numerous papers. More specifically, my work as university president from 2016 to 2021 in Kenya at the United States International University Africa, the only American-style university in the region, which is accredited both in the United States and in Africa. As well as, of course, having served in other administrative positions as college dean and academic vice president at two universities in the US. These positions, administrative positions, enabled me to understand, I think, the challenges and opportunities facing higher education institutions on both sides of the Atlantic. And it also, I think, gave me opportunities that I would not have had otherwise to participate in numerous national, in this case, both in Kenya and the United States, and international associations, conferences and conversations on higher education, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. I left my presidency towards the end of 2021, and the actual writing of the book was facilitated by my next appointment at Case Western Reserve University as Associate Provost, in which I was involved in several university-wide initiatives and committees that got me thinking about key issues covered in the book. So, for example, I led efforts at the university to revive a lifelong learning college that had existed, from the 1920s, but following the merger of Western Reserve University and Case Institute of Technology to create Case Western University, Reserve University in 1967. That college, disappeared, and the provost was very keen to revive it in terms of lifelong learning, given what is going on in higher ed. So I was charged with leading that effort. So it got me really thinking a lot about lifelong learning. And then secondly, I participated in a number of committees, two of which are reflected in the book. One was on the implications of the Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action. Before the ruling was made, the provost convened a group of people to think through what would the implications be for the university. And then another was a committee on the future of education post COVID-19 pandemic. And that again got me thinking about what kind of future higher education institutions likely to have, the trajectory of these institutions as the pandemic recedes from memory, although obviously it had a major impact on how we conducted our business as universities. And then another, sort of opportunity came in 2022 when I received the W.E.B. Du Bois Fellowship at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University that enabled me to discuss the book project with other fellows, and Harvard being Harvard with an exceptional group of scholars. So really, it's my administrative experiences over the last several decades, and certainly over the last 10 years, as well as my interest in intellectual history and the opportunities that I was afforded to be able to actually sit down and think and write.
Sorry, Henry. Wow, I will say the section, there's several parts of the book that really were compelling for me. And really, I think you mapped out some issues in ways that I haven't seen before. Your chapter that deals specifically with COVID-19 is particularly rich in a variety of ways. But I think maybe it's just me, but because we all lived through it and it seems so recent that really, I don't know that there's been really deep reflection about what COVID-19 meant to higher education institutions. And certainly, even when I think about that, those institutions in North America, I hadn't thought about its impact globally. And I think that chapter is extremely interesting and really poses some important questions as we think about the future of higher education. What I know you talked about the committee that sort of was formed to sort of consider some of these issues, but when we think about COVID-19 and the pandemic and its impact on higher education, what are some major sort of takeaways for administrators and leaders? You were president during, I guess, the first part, because you said certainly by 2022, I think we had the vaccine or nearly had it. I don't know about that being the case everywhere in the world, certainly, but in the States, we had access to the vaccine. So are there major takeaways that we've learned or should have learned from COVID-19 and thinking about the future of higher education?
Yes. As we all know, COVID-19 was once in a century pandemic in terms of its breadth and depth of impact. It affected every sector, the economy, it affected, of course, employment, education, mental health, you name it, everything was affected by the pandemic. And I think there are a number of, for us in higher education, there were, of course, very direct impacts in how we conduct teaching and learning. And secondly, how we think about research and scholarship. What kind of research and scholarship is important for society, for impact, and how we think about finances and managing our institutions. Because COVID-19 also had a major impact on finances of many universities. And I think some of the financial challenges we are seeing in higher education, both on the continent of Africa as well as in the United States and other parts of the world, are really sort of leftovers or consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it had an impact also, as we know, on mental health, which has become a major issue for universities all over the world to deal with, both in terms of the students who have been coming on our campuses, whose education was disrupted by COVID-19. And at the same time, because of the very actions and activities and initiatives that we undertook during COVID-19, I think we have learned, a few critical lessons about building institutional resilience. And I think those lessons are critical for us to make sure that we are strategic in the way we think about them. Many universities are really following what I call a three-pronged approach to thinking about the effects or the legacies, the impact, the aftermath of COVID-19. One is, some institutions have been in a hurry to return to the past prior to COVID. So that return agenda, and more or less ignore the implications of COVID-19 on how we conducted our business during that pandemic, as well as, of course, how it affected the people that we're most obligated to, namely the students, how they learn, their mental health, as I said a moment ago. And then other institutions have been saying to themselves, what are the lessons that we can take from COVID-19 that we can use productively to reform our institutions, to improve, to strengthen, to give them more resilience? Because we all know that there are all sorts of crises that universities have dealt with before, and certainly that we are likely to deal with in the future. And therefore, what are the lessons we've learned that we can use to reform our institutions to make them more resilient? So the reform agenda. And then the final agenda that I see many universities adopting, the ones that go beyond the return agenda or the reform agenda, is to say, this was a once in a lifetime, once in a century crisis. And we need to rethink entirely how we do our business, the transformation agenda. So going beyond mere sort of tinkering with systems. So I do think that universities are faced with those three opportunities, three challenges, and they're not mutually exclusive, of course. We have to do business as we did before COVID. Obviously, institutions are not simply transformed by one crisis into something totally new. And we also have to reform in areas that reform makes sense. But we also have to transform. I think the ones that are going to become stronger, in the future are the ones that really think very strategically about the transformation and reform agendas.
I love those three, and I think that's so true. This issue of transformation, because I'm thinking that, was this really like an interruption or disruption? Did we just pause and we're trying to come back again in the same way, or we really, or did this disrupt in a way that's going to be generative and certainly transformative? And so I think that's very, very, very powerful. Um, Let me ask another question, because I want to linger on this, but I there's some other questions I need to ask, because again, this is really, because I want to say that I'm wondering. I want to ask this before I go to the next question. It seems to me that when we think about COVID-19, based upon what you just shared and what's in your, certainly it's in your book, and also we think about these other things that are happening nationally, in terms of, this the public perception of higher education, this ideal of higher educations being sort of liberal bastions, or certainly sort of untouched or sacred space that folks cannot change or alter significantly. And so some of that, in terms of our understanding of what the academy is and our place in it, can be sort of frightening uh, for not only institutions but the people who work and attend and sort of have reveled, if you will, in the ideal of a university. I'm just wondering if those sort of competing realities, what challenges that will bode, will have for us as we as we enter this new space. I try to think about HBCUs as what does it mean to be an HBCU in the 22nd century? How do we make sure that we're around and that we're productive and that we're continuing to do the work that we've been doing? And when I think about all these things sort of affecting how we see our institutions ourselves, I just wonder what that will look like as we move forward, or what it should look like.
Right. Yeah, those are really rich questions, and we could spend
We could, exactly,
all day talking about them. But let me perhaps try to answer it in a number of ways. One is simply, share with the readers, some of the other themes which are connected to what you just asked. The book really, as you noted, deals with many themes, 8 in particular. The first sort of chapter deals with issues pertaining specifically to Africa. And then the last chapter, chapter 8, deals with themes pertinent to the United States. So the first chapter looks at, I just, sort of mentioned the titles, the struggle for African universities and knowledges. And then the second chapter, second up to 7th, I'm trying to do a comparative analysis. So the second chapter is titled Higher Education and Development. So the role of higher education in terms of socioeconomic changes in the United States and on the African continent. And the third is on managing and financing universities. And the fourth is what we've just been talking about, navigating the COVID-19 pandemic. And the 5th chapter is titled The Futures of Education, Where Are We Going? And the 6th, the imperatives of lifelong learning. And the 7th, repositioning the humanities and social sciences. And then finally, the 8th chapter, which is, as I said a moment ago, focused specifically on the United States, America's troubles with affirmative action. To, sort of answer your question as to what is happening in terms of perceptions of universities. What has happened, and these chapters in different ways are dealing with that question. What has happened over the last 40 years, and certainly since the beginning of this century, a number of broad societal structural changes which have impacted universities, impacted them in terms of their finances, impacted them in terms of how they, they teach and do research and so on and so forth, and certainly impacted the ways in which they are perceived by the public. And one of the key forces has been towards the privatization of higher education. And this is, of course, seen in many different ways, one of which is the fact that tuition, the cost of education is increasingly borne, whether it's in private or public institutions, is increasingly borne by the students and their families. And this has major implications in terms of expectations of the university, the return on investment by the students, their parents, their families, and the society at large. If we are paying so much, what are we getting out of it? And this has also led to, ironically, a situation whereby at one level, the public entities, public agencies have increasingly withdrawn from supporting universities, but their proclivity to intervene in what universities do has actually increased. So you're finding that it doesn't matter what the issue is, whether it's the content of what we teach, how we teach, the balance between disciplines within institutions is really dictated increasingly by market forces, but also by public expectations of return on investment. And this has led to a situation in many societies, including the United States, and many societies around the world, in Africa, as well as, of course, here and other parts of the world, in which universities are under enormous pressure to respond to increasingly partisan and highly politicized publics, as well as, of course, we all know in the literature on higher education, the much more interest by parents and sponsors and guardians of our students to see the return on investment, to ask more questions than used to be the case. When I was going to school, my parents were very excited that I was in college. That was about it. But for me now, with children going to college, I'm not just interested in, them going to college and at the end of the 4 years earn a degree, but I'm probably much more interested than my parents were as to what my daughter is actually learning. And COVID actually intensified that because the students were taking their classes at home or in places where it was not purely private. Parents were able to hear or overhear what the classes were doing. So public interest, public intervention, public perceptions of higher education are much more intense than was the case a generation ago. And this, of course, is forcing universities to recalibrate how we do our business. The microscope on what we do is much larger and much sharper than it used to be.
Sorry, I'm in my office and my lights just went out. They're timed,
Yes.
so okay, so sorry about that. But oh, I agree. So when we think about what that means for, sorry, okay, she'll edit that. Okay, but what this ideal public perception and what that means for our university certainly is a critical point for us in higher education, and certainly we think about all these sort of competing issues, and also certainly in your book you mentioned that I always call higher education a cottage industry, but it really is this issue of free market. I mean, certainly those people are paying for education, they're borrowing money to attend the public. As you said, there's intensity around their scrutiny. There's this issue of return on investment that is public. It's a common conversation about what am I getting in return for my investment in my own education, my child's education, etc. So very important. So let me ask you. I know when you mentioned Chapter 8 in terms of your discussion about affirmative action and the June 2023 decision and others, and you cite heavily work by Amari Swinton and Cook and their book about the relevancy of HBCUs, and also John Wilson's book that also focuses on HBCUs as well. So I'm wondering, in what ways do you think your work or this book speaks specifically to HBCUs? And certainly we weren't immune from the impact of COVID-19 or the other forces that we've talked about. But what specifically about HBCUs? And also, you mentioned how certainly we could learn something about resiliency, perhaps, from some African universities, which I thought was a very important point, really something to explore. But what about HBCUs in terms of the reimagining of higher education? Where do HBCUs fit in?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And in fact, I was so delighted that I didn't finish writing the book, as you probably noticed, that the acknowledgements page says that the book was finished on the 30th of November, 2023 in Washington, D.C. Because by then I had joined, of course, Howard. I joined Howard in October of 2023. Because I knew I was coming to Howard a few weeks before that, I was very keen to reflect a bit more on HBCUs than I had reflected up to that point. So I think there are perhaps 4 ways of answering your question. One is that HBCUs are obviously embedded in the higher education ecosystem. and the challenges the sector is facing and the challenges that it is undergoing, HBCUs are an integral part of that. And then secondly, as you noted, in the book, I discussed the crucial role that HBCUs have played in American higher education, the chapter on affirmative action, in which I look at the recent books by, John Sylvanus Wilson, his book called Hope and Healing, Black Colleges and American Democracy, published in 2022, in which he argues that HBCUs have authored 3 African-American transformations, up from illiteracy, poverty, and marginality. And he shows that HBCUs are absolutely crucial for the renewal of the American democratic project. And then, of course, our own, chair of the economics department, Professor Swinton, did a book as well, which looks, a co-authored book in which he looks at the role that HBCUs have played in this country. And there is a page he gives absolutely stunning data that I've used ever since in all my conversations with people. I usually quote that data in one on 2 pages when he says, for example, if you allow me to quote, more than 80% of all Black Americans who have received degrees in medicine and dentistry did so at 2 HBCUs, Howard University and Meharry Medical College. 10 of the top 11 campuses producing bachelor's degree recipients who subsequently earned a PhD are HBCUs. HBCUs were the undergraduate homes of 3/4 of Black individuals holding any doctoral degree. 3/4 of all Black military officers earned their baccalaureate degree at an HBCU. 4/5 of all Black federal judges are HBCU graduates. 1/2 of all Black faculty holding appointments at PWIs started their careers at an HBCU. I mean, this is absolutely stunning. It's the kind of information that people outside the HBCUs don't sometimes know. I was at a meeting recently at one PWI, and I was sharing with them the transformative role that HBCUs have had on American society, and I was quoting some of these figures, and the person almost fell off the chair, or the people rather almost fell off their chair because they didn't realize. And then thirdly, perhaps I think it's important to mention that HBCUs have played a major role in educating generations of African graduates, some of whom, of course, returned back to their countries and became national leaders. The first president of Nigeria, Nanda Azikiwe, was a student at Howard in the 1920s, doing political science. Kwame Nkrumah was a student at Lincoln in Pennsylvania. Dr. Hastings Banda, who was the first president of my own country, Malawi, did his medical degree at Meharry. And all of us grew up knowing there was a place called Meharry. And through that, we grew up knowing there were HBCUs. So the role and impact of HBCUs on Africa is huge. HBCUs were the incubators of Pan-Africanism. People like W.B. Du Bois, as we all know, not only studied at Fisk and taught at Atlanta University and so on, before he did his doctorate at Harvard. This Pan-Africanist movement that influenced those leaders, the Azikiwes, the Nkrumahs, the Bandas, and the subsequent generations of activists and politicians and corporate executives and civil society leaders across Africa, shows that HBCUs have had a global impact, a global footprint certainly when it comes to Africa, and certainly when it comes to the African diaspora in the Caribbean, in South America, in Europe, and so on and so forth. So there are intellectual and ideological, as well as institutional ties that bind African higher education systems and HBCUs. And perhaps, I could conclude, saying that the ways in which we can, again, to use that word, recalibrate our relationships between HBCUs, African institutions, institutions in the Caribbean, in South America, with large African diaspora populations. And in that context, also start thinking seriously about institutions in Europe, where the African diaspora is growing very rapidly. It's always been there for centuries, of course, as well as parts of Asia. I think, I would recommend some of the following things. One is we need to intentionally strengthen HBCU's global engagement and knowledge production. So to your point earlier, HBCU leaders and leaders of African institutions, Caribbean institutions, institutions in South America that have large African diaspora populations, can draw lessons from each other, of each other's struggles in producing and asserting their own knowledges. And I think by deepening international collaborations, HBCUs can create stronger global research networks, amplify their intellectual contributions, and challenge dominant knowledge paradigms that marginalize Black intellectual traditions. And the other thing perhaps we can also learn from each other is that the recognition of higher education as a driver of socioeconomic development. As I said, the two books I quoted show the incredible socioeconomic impact that HBCUs have had in the United States. And it's the same story that universities, of course, in the Caribbean, universities in Africa have had in their respective societies. So, leaders of these institutions can use insights, drawn from their respective experiences to advocate for stronger investments in higher education as tools for economic and social mobility. And the lessons, from global contexts, I believe, reinforce that well-funded, accessible universities play a critical role in national development, an argument that can be leveraged, I would like to think, to secure greater public and private sector support for HBCUs. And I think we can also learn from each other in terms of rethinking university management and financing, one of the chapters in the book. Leaders of our respective institutions across the Pan-African world, as I like to call it, can explore diversified funding models, borrowing from each other's experiences, including, of course, stronger endowments, innovative public-private partnerships, and new revenue-generating programs that align with institutional missions while securing long-term sustainability. And specifically coming back to what we talked about earlier in terms of COVID-19, we can also borrow lessons from each other and adapt our institutions to build much more resilience in our institutions. Certainly, COVID-19, as we talked earlier, revealed many structural weaknesses in higher education globally, including digital divides, inequities in funding, and so on and so forth. And HBCU leaders, I believe, as well as leaders of higher education on the continent and elsewhere in the diaspora, can apply lessons from this, sort of experience and the analysis, perhaps, that is offered in the book to strengthen digital infrastructure develop more flexible learning models, and ensure institutional preparedness for future crises. And on the future, I think we need to become a lot more savvy and much more smart and strategic as institutions to prepare for the future of education. And in the book, as you may have noted, I'm exploring various trends in education up to, based on studies, global studies done by UNESCO, done by the OECD, done by the International Association of Universities, done by regional, associations in Europe, in Africa, in the United States itself and elsewhere. How we need to seriously rethink and anticipate shifts in technology, pedagogy, and workforce demands. This includes, of course, the need for AI-driven education, interdisciplinary learning, and the expansion of alternative credentialing systems to keep our universities competitive and forward-looking. And this, of course, means, in my view, prioritizing strategically lifelong learning. We must embrace lifelong learning as a central strategy, in my view, for student and alumni success. This means developing robust continuing education programs, micro-credentialing opportunities, and workforce-aligned curricula that serves not only traditional students, but also working professionals seeking career transitions. And in this context, I think one of the dangers I see in higher education, including at HBCUs, is the ways in which the humanities and social sciences have been increasingly devalued. This is not an HBCU problem. This is a problem across higher education, and it's not only in the United States or in Africa. This is global. It's a global challenge. In Europe, in Australasia, in South America, the Caribbean, it's a similar problem. There is pressure to focus on STEM, to focus on occupational fields, vocational fields, what I call the vocationalization of higher education. I think, and I believe, precisely because of the rapid changes that are taking place in education, in society, in the economy, because of digitalization, and more recently, of course, AI. The skills and competencies that are going to become even more important than they have ever been historically, which are provided through the liberal arts, through the humanities and social sciences, skills for critical thinking, for civic engagement, for cultural understanding, for interpersonal, international, intercultural, information literacies, interdisciplinary literacies. Those skills are even more important now and in the future. And we need to make sure that our educational systems really continue to reassert the value of the humanities and societies and social sciences, areas where HBCUs have historically excelled, precisely because we had to incorporate our experiences, our voices, and our visions and values into the corpus of knowledge that had intentionally excluded us because of Eurocentric and, in many cases, intentionally racist constructions of knowledge. So we cannot allow ourselves to abandon the humanities and social sciences. We need to ensure that they're strong. And then finally, I think the question of affirmative action is one I think we have to revisit the debates. And in the book, I talk about how, there was a sabotage of affirmative action from the 1970s. Originally, affirmative action was really a restorative agenda to provide redress, historic redress for communities of African descent in this country that had been marginalized, exploited for centuries. And that redress had to be provided in ways that would ensure that going into the future, the opportunities for the African American community were greater than had been before. And without going into a lot of details, that reparatory justice discourse was overtaken by the diversity discourse, which in my view was a very intentional, and I go into details why I think it was intentional, sabotage of what the original civil rights agenda was. And of course, we have seen now more recently DEI being turned into a curse word. I think we need to revisit seriously the discourse, the language, the ways in which the intention of correcting historical wrongs is deliberated, and how we can talk in ways that are intelligent and also avoid a situation which we have seen in the anti-DEI from the 1970s, from the Baki decision of 1978, when DEI was actually incorporated into that discourse to replace the original discourse in which underrepresented minorities end up being used against each other. In this case, of course, between immigrant communities, communities of Asian descent being used as victims because Black people, are benefiting disproportionately from, which of course we all know is not true.
Powerful. One of the things that's, well, main thing, I guess, that's so, it leaves me, this conversation leaves me with a variety of ideas. One is that often when we think about this time in higher education, there's a tendency to want to restrict rather than expand. And what you just talked about in terms of global engagement, understanding our connection to universities throughout the diaspora, the value of the work and its impact on our overall development, and when we think about investment, that really, in lifelong learning, gives us some ways to think about HBCUs and similarly, like I say, situated universities in a different way. Because again, rather than to cower and to feel like we're under attack, to really think strategically, as you say, about how we can be more expansive and also recalibrate, transform, make sure that as we approach this next century, that we have institutions that reflect, our thriving moving forward. So I want to sort of thank you certainly for the book, but also what you've just shared, because again, even for me, and I am an optimistic person, and also I believe in our institutions and know their power, as you've so well articulated, but it sometimes can be discouraging, particularly when political whims and other perspectives challenge some things we know that are important to understand as we think about our institutions and our institutions' future. So this opportunity to be more expansive and to think in different ways about who we are as institutions, not single institutions, but an ecosystem, not just in this physical place, but really beyond that. Because when I think about, I love these data that you discussed, mentioned from Professor Swinton's book and also from John Wilson. But not only are these, we always often mention direct recipients of education at HBCUs, but also, all of the other folks who benefited. Whether, as you mentioned, the president of your university or my teacher or my minister or lawyer, the ways in which HBCUs have permeated every nook and cranny, really, of the diaspora is incredibly important. And we have to really remember that and hold and know that that's a responsibility that we have as institutions to continue that work. So again, much appreciated. So again, it's one of the things that we're doing in a couple of weeks. We're hosting a conference that really looks at empirical research, HBCUs and HBCU researchers in terms of agency and impact of empirical research, and trying to we're identifying a variety of topics, perhaps that the various presenters are going to talk about, that they are going to talk about. But I'm wondering, are there particular areas of research that you think that we ought to be examining in higher education, and certainly as it relates to HBCUs? Certainly, I think about Jelani Favor's work around the humanities, the importance of the humanities and social sciences. I mean, his great work around Shelter in the Time of Storm that really chronicles how critical the social science and humanities have been in sort of shaping what he calls a second curriculum at HBCUs. But in terms of research areas that deserve exploration, what areas come to mind for you?
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for that question. In fact, I've been really mulling over that question quite a bit. You know, partly because, of course, now I'm located at Howard, and given my role here, I've been thinking quite a lot about that question. So perhaps I could answer it in a number of ways, again, based on what I've tried to think through the book, and obviously I'll continue thinking through these questions, over time. But it seems to me that perhaps the first thing we may want to think about is expanding research on HBCUs and African universities as global knowledge hubs. I know on the African continent, there are few places where serious research is being done on higher education as a field. And of course, in this country, there are also places where people are doing research on higher education as a field, and Howard, has been the home of of many of these important scholars on higher education, including the journal that has been edited for a long time on education and so on.
Sure.
So I think we need to expand and bring together researchers on HBCUs and African higher education to share research agendas, to also use that as a platform, as an opportunity for building a cadre of younger researchers who think in comparative global terms. In this case, of course, anchoring their global perceptions of higher education through the prism of the diaspora paradigm. So, and really insisting in that comparative research on HBCUs and African universities, and positioning them not as peripheral institutions, but as central to global knowledge production. And those future studies could explore how these institutions can collaborate to amplify their influence in shaping intellectual and policy discourses in different geographies on equity, on development, on excellence, on education. And perhaps the second area that we may productively think of encouraging our researchers, particularly the younger upcoming scholars, those in graduate school, and of course, as they enter the academy, to really build this knowledge system, is strengthening policies for higher education as a public good. As I indicated earlier, and we talked about this earlier, my book talks a lot about the, highlights, the underfunding and market-driven policies that have marginalized many institutions serving historically underrepresented communities, and even now, of course, affecting institutions that previously did not think of themselves as being financially strapped. In fact, the financial crisis for universities is global. If you read, which I do on a regular basis, the academic media, Times Higher Education, University World News, Inside Higher Education, the Chronicle of Higher Education, University Business, you name it. You read the same story in Britain, in Switzerland, in Sweden, in Germany, in France, in South Korea, Japan, Australia, let alone Africa, that universities finding themselves in very difficult financial circumstances. And I think getting our researchers to engage in very rigorous, robust research on how do we strengthen higher education as a public good, and how do we translate that research into policy discussion on reinvesting in public higher education, particularly in this case, obviously, for HBCUs and African universities, ensuring that they have resources to fulfill their critical missions, I think is an important research question. I was very happy to see the book by Swinton and his colleagues, in which they use their expertise as economists to raise questions and provide data that shows powerfully, as I shared earlier, on the impact. We need to have the same thing done by people who are interested in medical research, who are interested in business research, who are interested in AI research, to really give us the data that shows the impact that we have and the impact that we could have. And then, another area which, sort of emerges from my book that I do a lot of thinking about, partly because of my own experience as a university administrator, is rethinking leadership development for a more equitable higher education system. We all know that higher education leadership often reflects, systemic inequities, and the ACE, American Council on Education, produces these reports periodically on the profiles of university leaders in this country, and similar studies are produced in other parts of the world, including Africa, and I think, it's important for us, our researchers, to increase research or to develop research agendas and encourage policy discussions on how do we diversify leadership pipelines? How do we equip HBCU and African diaspora administrators and faculty with resources to assume top roles in academia, and fostering leadership models that center justice, inclusion, and institutional resilience. When I became president of the United States International University in Africa, in Kenya, of course, I had not been president before, so I had to learn what it meant to be a president. And I looked for places to get that quote unquote training, and if nothing else, also to build networks with fellow presidents who are just assuming leadership positions. And unfortunately, there were not many places that I could go to on the continent. There are some programs run in South Africa and places like that. But I ended up attending the new president's seminar at Harvard in 2016, and another one in 2017 on new presidents and fundraising or development. We need to create, in my view, more such opportunities that not only provide training for leadership, whether for department chair, for dean of a college, for provosts, or for presidents, but also training that resonates with our mission, with our values, and with our place in American higher education, and in the case of Africa, our place in African higher education, and for both our place in global higher education. How do we get our leaders that think strategically local, but also national and global. And then it seems to me also we might fruitfully focus, on, in terms of research, how do we create innovative university management and financing models with our ongoing financial challenges? As I said, this is not just for HBCUs or African universities, but it affects us in particular ways because of the history of underfunding, and in the case of Africa, the history of post-colonial Africa, in which economic policy has been dictated to a very large extent by international financial institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, which since the 1980s urged African governments essentially to divest from funding higher education, hence the crisis that affected those systems since the 1980s. So how do we, get research-based, policy interventions, as I said earlier, including public-private partnerships, alternative credentialing systems, philanthropic investment strategies. How do we mobilize our alumni in ways that make sense? That kind of research, I think, is imperative for our own financial sustainability, for our financial survival. And I think also perhaps it might be useful for us, again, and I'm drawing this from the book, do we advance lifelong learning as a tool for equity? Equity intergenerationally, equity in terms of the other markers of equity, in terms of gender, in terms of abilities, and so on and so forth. And lifelong learning is increasingly going to become indispensable for many, many reasons, including obviously the technological changes in place, the changes in demographic lifespans, people living longer. So the era of a three-stage life, learn, work, and retire is no longer going to work in that way. It's no longer working that way. It's learn, work, learn, work, learn, work, retire. So because changes are, jobs are changing so quickly, and the need for upskilling and reskilling and, however you want to call it, is only going to intensify. The things that kids enrolling today at our universities, the economy, the society they are going to enter 4 years from now, 6 years from now, is not exactly today. So some of the things we're teaching them now might become obsolete by the time they graduate. So how do we create our institutions as hubs of continuous education? And there are really fascinating examples from other countries in the world. I did, as part of my job at Case Western, I did a global study on how other universities are dealing with this. So for example, in Singapore, they're giving universities, and the government give the graduates credits, financial, and whereby they can use those credits to come back at any point in their after they graduated to acquire new skills that are necessary for their jobs. How do we translate that into our context as HBCUs with our alumni in ways that make sense? And then, of course, I want to belabor this point. How do we, with all these pressures for occupational skills, which are, of course, imperative, because we have to prepare our students for careers that if nothing else, they'll be able to pay the loans that they're carrying to get the education and have decent lives. How do we, in that environment, which becomes anti-humanistic learning, anti-social scientific research, how do we ensure that the social sciences and humanities are integral to how we teach our students and how we equip them. And this has implications for us. How do we ensure that our arts programs, our non-STEM programs, non-professional programs have the vibrancy that they're not simply restricted to those students in those areas, but your student doing medicine, doing engineering has a basic liberal arts literacy because they're going to work in society, they're going to work with people, and vice versa. How do we ensure that our students in the arts, in the humanities, in the social sciences have basic AI literacy, digital literacy, because they're going to work in a society where this is imperative in order to maneuver. So how do we do research that show us how we can promote pedagogy and curricula that impart certain basic skills across the curriculum, across the university? And of course, AI is something that is very fresh in my mind right now because, of course, as you know, at Howard, the president appointed the AI Council last June, and that initiative is extremely important for us to think through what it means. And I've participated very actively in that. And part of my participation is really to understand what the research is saying as to what's going on with AI and higher education, at a global level, at a regional level in Europe, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, and then, of course, at a national level in the United States, and at a sectoral level in terms of PWIs and HBCUs. And of course, finally, how do we land all that in terms of our own university? I'm a believer in ensuring that whatever we do, whatever field we are looking at, always let's put multiple lenses on that field. Global, regional, national, sectoral, and institutional.
I love that. I want to sort of capture in closing. I'm going to ask you for a final statement. Some of what you just said, because I think again is extremely powerful. This idea of rethinking or thinking about uh, universities across the diaspora as global knowledge hubs, I think is extremely powerful and extremely useful in terms of thinking about what we really do as institutions and how dominant notions or perspectives and worldviews, we have to begin to, we certainly have done that in terms of challenging it, but really in a strategic way, central way, sort of leverage all of our perspectives, as you said, multiple perspectives. I think it's very important. And again, empowering and again, looks toward expansion rather than sort of cowering in the midst of some of these questions about who we are as institutions. And then this higher ed policies for the public good, I think, is extremely important in terms of connecting those. I think it's extremely important. I think we talk about it, but how do we really operationalize that? And also this discussion about preparing leaders. Certainly, I teach in our Department of Leadership and Policy Studies, and we have a higher ed program that we prepare people specifically for roles at HBCUs. But I often ask, what specifically about the preparation is distinct? So, what, as you're saying, is there a framework, or how can we begin to identify elements of a framework that really would provide people with the perspectives, tools, the ways of thinking, intellectual knowledge needed and empirical knowledge that would help them to devise and develop strategies that could support our universities. And then finally, your point about lifelong learning, though certainly you address this in the book, but I don't know if I had missed this whole note, this connection to equity that you just really talked about. That I think is extremely important because oftentimes, in lifelong learning, that phrase has been around for a while, but really you've provided some new dimensions. And when we think about, certainly we think, oh, we want to make sure that folks, as you said, there's retiring. Oh, I don't know if I want to hear that, Dr. Zeleza. Okay, okay, because right now I'm thinking about planting
Yes, yes,
tomatoes and
yes.
becoming an expert gardener. But
Yeah,
nonetheless, you're exactly right.
right.
But in terms of what does that mean for the equity to make sure that folks, whatever stage they are in their own life, that they'll have the skills, knowledge, perspectives, and abilities to engage and to also be a part of society, be whether it be wage earners or participants, etc. So this is how you've sort of connected those two, lifelong learning and equity, which is certainly the case, is extremely powerful as well.
Right.
So I want to thank you for those comments, because again, I've taken copious notes and will continue to sort of reflect on some of the things we've talked about here. But in closing, do you have some final remarks for us in terms of this important work, re-envisioning the African and American academies? Any closing remarks for us that you'd like us to think about as we engage this work, and also our work as administrators or researchers primarily, or even folks who are enrolled?
Yeah, I think first of all is to thank you and congratulate the work that your center is doing. I think it's extremely important for us to see ourselves as a community of institutions where we share experiences, practices, innovations, ideas, and so on, because we're stronger working together than we are, working separately. And I know that there are also efforts to, bring engagements between HBCUs and African institutions. I think there is a conference in Botswana sometime in July. What I would like to perhaps urge is that we make these connections between university leaders, students, faculty, staff, administrators in the HBCUs with Africa, with the diaspora, much more intentional, much more organized in sort of, in their periodicity, so that we have opportunities to bring thought leadership. I would love, for example, to see, student government leaders at HBCUs meeting student government leaders in the Caribbean, in South America, in Africa, and share ideas, share experiences, and share, how, as the generation that is gonna take over sooner rather than later, how do they empower themselves, each other, to make significant change, transformation, impact on their universities, that their younger brothers and younger sisters, younger siblings, younger cousins and nephews and so on will come to. So organizing multiple levels of these engagements is something that, is one of my
He may come back up. Let me give it 1 second. See what's going on. Oh no. But either way, we can pause it and then start over.
Okay.
He may log back in.
I didn't know if it was.
Oh, perfect. You're back. Okay.
Sorry about that. I don't know, Dr. Zeleza, if it's your connection or mine, but okay.
Yeah, something went on.
Okay.
It's okay. Okay. You can start back with your thought.
So yeah, I just ended at the point I don't know if it was captured at the point that, at Howard, we're in a good place because we're just about to launch the Office of Global and Diaspora Engagement. And I was saying that office, part of its charge is precisely to ensure our engagement with universities, obviously across the world, but with a particular accent on universities in Africa and universities in the diaspora, South America, the Caribbean, and so on. And I was saying that it would be very, very critical for that office to work closely with the HBCU Research Leadership and Policy Center.
Well, that's exciting because, that's near and dear to me in a variety of ways. And so I've already plotted and planned my retirement, and it is on the continent. So, okay, I absolutely, positively am excited about that opportunity. So again, Dr. Zeleza, I just want to thank you. I want so much to thank you for joining us for this episode of Turning Pages. We certainly have much to learn about the reimagining or re-envisioning of the African and American universities. Certainly, your book helps us to sort of guides us through that process, and we appreciate it. And we look forward to future conversations with you about this work, and also how we can all work together to deepen our commitment to global engagement and actually act upon it. So again, thank you so much for joining Turning Pages. I'm Melanie Carter, Director of the Center for HBCU Research, Leadership, and Policy at Howard University. Have a great day.